This is John Musgrave. Thank you for coming to the podcast. If you like this content or this episode, please click like or even subscribe or hit that thumbs up button on your screen, and that'll help more people find us. Thanks for listening. He's the first king of northern Israel, Jeroboam. He's the one who leads the 10 northern tribes away from the son of David, beginning the divided kingdom. Number 3, Dakota, can you read number 3 for us?
What two nations do we see exiled in 1st and 2nd Kings?
Israel and Judah. Yeah, that's right. Number 4, Christina.
What two nations are the major enemies of God's people in 2nd Kings?
Okay, so our choices are A, Assyria and Babylon, B, Egypt and Philistia, C, Rome and Persia, D, Greece and the Hittite nation. So which is our correct answer there, you think? Yeah, A, Assyria and Babylon. They're the two major world powers as we're in 2nd Kings, and we're looking at exiles of Judah and Israel. Number 5, Manny.
Who's the king of Babylon at the end of 2nd Kings? And we also see in the book of Daniel.
Okay, so our fun names there: Shalmaneser, Sargon V, Tiglath-Pileser, Assurbanipal, and Nebuchadnezzar. Which one is the one who takes? He's the king of Babylon, who we see in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar. So we see him at the end of 2nd Kings, and we see him in Daniel very prominently in the first 4 chapters. Okay.
So Nebuchadnezzar does show up in 2nd Kings.
He does.
Question number 2 is wrong.
Ah. Yeah, question number 2 is 1st Kings. There we go.
Oh.
That's it. But you would be right if it said Kings, then we'd have Nebuchadnezzar. So you're substantively correct.
I'll take it.
You just didn't listen to your 4th grade teacher up here. It said, read the question.
Details, man.
Yeah, so we do see, it's fun when you see crossover between books of Scripture, and Nebuchadnezzar is one of those crossovers. We see him in 2nd Kings at the end, in chapter 24 and 25, the last 2 chapters of 2nd Kings. And then he's prominent. Like you see him really as a person interacting and saying things in Daniel 1 through 4. Okay. So that brings us to just review points here that we won't spend time on because we went before. Who's the author of 1st and 2nd Kings?
I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. So unknown author of 1st and 2nd Kings. What did do you remember what we said about a writing date for 1st and 2nd Kings? And we remember this was one book. We've just divided it for convenience sake, especially in the ancient world. It was too big to fit on one scroll, probably, and so they just split it in half and put what's in 1st Kings 4 was on one scroll, and then the follow-up scroll was 2nd Kings. But so. It
was after the death of the king that was in prison, but I can't remember his name.
Good. So it's after the death of Jehoiachin, who was the king. He's not the absolute last king in Jerusalem. He's exiled in 598, 597. And then his uncle takes over, Zedekiah, for 11 years back in Jerusalem. While most of Israel is already exiled. But Jehoiachin is son of Josiah. Josiah has three sons who end up ruling, all who get exiled somewhere. But yeah, so he dies. That's one of the last things we see in 2nd Kings. Remember it said he's taken from his prison cell. He was relieved of his prison clothes and dressed properly, and sits at the table of the king in Babylon and eats all the food he wants for the rest of his days. And so we know from that, the end of 2 Kings, that Jehoiachin then died because the rest of his days is a definitive point of a statement of history, meaning the writer knew Jehoiachin had died, and that till his dying day, he ate at the table of the king of Babylon as kind of almost an honored, conquered king there, which is a little uptick of hope at the end of Kings as a book. So that's our front starting date, the death of Jehoiachin, which we know just from history to be around 562. So the exile starts around 600. And so 562, you've got Jehoiachin's death. And then what's our last likely date for King's writing?
538.
538, yeah. And why do you say 538?
That's when they went back to Israel.
Yeah. So the exile finishes at 538. So 539, Darius, also known by Cyrus, depending on what language you're talking about, he has those two names. He releases the Judahites to go back to Jerusalem to inhabit that land again and to rebuild the temple. And so it's probably the end of 539, and then by 538 they're back there. That's right. It's also in the guide there, so we know it's true. It's in that guide. And so why do we then say First and Second Kings has a last likely writing date of 538? Why do we say that's a terminus or an end point for us?
That's pretty important, so we would have recorded it.
Exactly. Yeah, so Joyce said it exactly. So if it's pretty important, so it would have been recorded, most likely. Don't die for that. Someone says, are you saying Second Kings couldn't be written after the exile was over? Say, I'm pretty sure, but don't kill me over it. But yeah, it's one of the ways you date. And so what we're doing there is just noting how we date books. We date books when they're a narrative, when they're recording history. We date books by the last thing recorded as history in the book. And that's your starting date. That's the first possible writing date. If the book has recorded something as past history, the book has to be written after that last event. So you look for the last event in a book, and that's your start point for the earliest possible writing date. And then you look for the next big event in biblical history and say, is this recorded in this book, or does this book seem to be ignorant of when that happened and how it happened and what happened with it? And Second Kings doesn't say anything about it. It just leaves us up with, well, Jehoiachin died in exile, and at the end of his life, he got out of prison and ate at the king's table. But that's it. So it looks like we're writing this zone here between, so you've got Daniel and the nobles leave Jerusalem in 605. That's the first exile. Nebuchadnezzar takes the best and brightest, and so that's Daniel and his friends. And then the main exile is about here, probably 597 here. And this is where most of the people are taken away. And then finally, in 586, you've got the destruction of the temple and the final exile. A lot of people here are just killed at this point, but some go off into exile. And so Ezekiel talks about this, and he says, like God tells him, like, take your hair and cast some of it into the wind and burn some other of the hair and that kind of thing. And it's describing the three things that happened to the people in 586. Some are just scattered, some are killed, and some are exiled, go off into exile. This is where Jehoiachin is with this middle main exile. And then he dies in about 562. And then the return from exile, they're back in 538. And so here we are for our book, right there. After the death of Jehoiachin, but before the return from exile. And so that affects us. It's an important thing to note because that affects how we see what the author is saying, why he records certain details and why he doesn't record certain details, and what his emphasis is when he's recording details. Any story that the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings is giving, he's got 1 million details and he gives you 800. Why does he select the 800? Well, because he's making a point to this group who's in exile still, who hasn't returned from exile. Okay? So that's our writing date. Original purpose, we'll read this, which just goes right along with this writing date here. Jim, could you read this for us? Sorry, there. Not there.
To show
Not there.
God's people why they had been exiled to Babylon, and to teach them to believe and respond to the words of God's prophets, repenting and looking to God and his grace to return them to the promised land.
Okay, so they weren't returned to the promised land. They're being told why they were exiled. They were told, listen to the prophets. The prophets had told them, you'll be exiled, and they were. So they knew what the prophets said was true. And what the prophets said that hadn't happened yet would come true. And part of what the prophets before the exile said was, you'll be returned to the land, and the son of David will take the throne again, and the temple will be rebuilt. You have those three things are part of the prophets that are not the case for the writing audience, for the original audience. And so 1st and 2nd Kings has this emphasis. It's the main point, if you want to just get Kings down in a simpler purpose statement, God is showing the people why they deserve the exile. That's it. And so will positive or negative things be emphasized about all the kings? Negative, yeah. When you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles, especially 2nd Chronicles, which chronicles the history of the Judean kings during the divided kingship. 2nd Chronicles doesn't deal with the northern kings, just the sons of David. It much more emphasizes the positive things of the Judean kings. Whereas 1st Kings, when you read 1st Kings, you see the negative things of some of those same kings. And it's because when we're in 1st Kings here, we're emphasizing what those kings did that deserve the exile. When we look at Chronicles, Chronicles is written here at 538. And so Chronicles emphasizes the positive things those same kings did so that they'll know what to do as they've gotten back into Jerusalem. Follow this positive example. And so Chronicles is a much more positive book because the author's writing to those who've returned from exile and showing them how to live. But Kings is showing them why they deserve the exile, why they were there, and what they should repent of so that they don't remain in exile longer than they need to. Okay. So that brings us to our outline, and so this is what we hadn't looked at yet last week. And so our first outline point here, Bob, are we to you?
Yeah, 1 Kings 1:1. The kingship of the sons of David is God's design and was rightly established under Solomon.
Okay, so the first part of Kings 1 through 10ish here is showing David hands over the kingship to Solomon. And Solomon's glorious kingdom. And it was better than David's. The temple's built. Worship is happening as it should. Foreign kings and queens are coming to Solomon and giving him money and gifts and saying, in essence, that was to say, please don't attack us. We'll be your friends. We won't cause you any trouble. And Solomon wasn't seeking to gain land outside the promised land because that land wasn't for them. Solomon just seeks to maintain the land that David had conquered, the fullness of the promised land. And so chapters 1 through 10 of 1 Kings are Israel in all its glory. Israel as it should be. But then so that's first the main section of 1 Kings starting chapter 1. Shows that the sons of David, kingship by them is God's design. Now, why is that important for you if you are part of the original audience? Why is that? Why is the author's proving this in the first 10 chapters important for you as you sit in exile in Babylon? Why do you need to know that?
Because those 10 tribes didn't follow the sons of David.
Okay, the 10 tribes didn't follow the sons of David, but you're not one of the 10 tribes. You're Judah and sitting in Babylon.
Well, eventually they're going to get restored, and they'll need the sons of David.
True, but you're Judahites in exile, and you're in exile. Why do you need to know this?
Change your ways.
Okay.
It's God's design.
It's God's design, and what might you be thinking if you're in exile after all these wicked sons of David have gotten you into exile?
That God's left you.
You still need to be under David's son.
It's going to be another line.
Yeah, say that again, Joyce.
You still need to be under David's sons. when
Yes.
you get back.
Those in exile are saying, yeah, a lot of good David's sons did for us. Here we are. Get it? That's the main thing you're thinking. Great leadership we had. Look at, whatever. Look at the condition of our people. Look at what's happened to me. I lost my land, given to me by Joshua through, years ago. I'm living in a foreign land. I'm oppressed. I'm not living in the promise and blessing God had for me. And I was under a son of David, so a lot of good they did for me. And so this is showing what First Kings 1 through 10 shows over and over again, and you can see it in the selection, you can see it in the details, you can see it in the verbiage that's used, is that God very specifically said the sons of David and nobody else were to be kings over God's people. And if those kings were faithful, which Solomon was for 10 chapters, there was unprecedented glory and blessing for us, even above David. And so that's what 1 Kings 1 through 10 is showing. The height of Israel, the height of promised land living is under Solomon. Not only are they not being attacked, foreign nations are coming in and giving us gifts. And Solomon's so wealthy, he gives those people who give him gifts more than they gave him. And it doesn't matter. And you have statements like there was, silver were like pebbles in those days because there was so much gold. And so you're being reminded in 1 Kings as you're reading it in exile, the path for us is not to chuck the son of David. God's design for us is to have a son of David be our king, but he needs to be faithful. And so in 1 Kings, we'll see that, it's also then at the end of those first 10 chapters that we see Solomon's unfaithfulness causes all the trouble, causes the divide, causes all the bad kings who follow his bad sons, who follow in his steps, and causes us to be in exile. Okay? So that the solution is not to get rid of the son of David, it's to have a son of David and to encourage, if necessary, that son of David to be faithful. Because your blessing in the promised land depends on what? Think of the gospel. A faithful king. That's the gospel. Your blessing today as you sit in these seats depends on a faithful son of David, doesn't it? That's the gospel message. Your blessing doesn't depend upon you. right? Paul writes in Galatians 2:15 and 16. He said, "We who are Jews by birth know that a man is not justified by observing the law. We've known this, but by faith in Jesus Christ." And so Old Testament Israel, they have faith in the Son of David, and they're blessed, and they're justified. And so that's the message there. We need a faithful Son of David. We don't need to chuck the Son of David, because we've read what book of Scripture? Judges. Right? The solution is not no king. The solution is not Abimelech as king, Gideon's son. The solution is the Son of David as king. Because when we have no king, everyone does what? What's right in his own eyes. And 1 Kings then also goes on to, we'll see it here, to demonstrate how things were for those who are under not a son of David. That is, northern Israel. Things are not good for northern Israel during their existence, as we read 1 Kings, because those aren't sons of David. And so God's people in the north are suffering all through 1 Kings. But in 1 Kings, you also have some faithful sons of David and God's people being blessed during that time too. Even though predominantly, I think it's 8 out of 20 sons of David are faithful. 8 out of 20. So you have some sons of David who are faithful and God's people are blessed. But predominantly, the sons of David haven't been faithful. And during those unfaithful kings, you have covenant curses. Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 on the people. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. Second part, we pick up here with 1 Kings 3:1. So 1 Kings 1 through 1 and 2 show Solomon. I know you perfectly remember this from when we were preaching through 1 Kings, but it shows how Solomon cleans everything up. Everyone who is a rebel against David, Solomon takes care of. David says to Solomon, don't let his gray hair go down to the grave. End him before he has gray hair, in other words. And so Solomon does that. He takes care of Adonijah, who had raised himself up as king instead of Solomon. Takes care of the wicked prophets and priests who had sided with Adonijah, the wrong king. Okay, but in 1 Kings 3, we go along here and let's see, Anna, can you read up here on the front? 1 Kings 3, 1, our second section of Kings.
Solomon's kingship brought blessing and glory to all Israel through its wise and righteous administration, and especially by its establishing proper worship.
Okay. So the Queen of Sheba comes in and she says, I heard about how great this was, but seeing even how your servants serve, wow. It's administration par excellence. Just everything, the way it's organized, the way Solomon runs the kingdom with all his wisdom is just, she's flabbergasted, the Queen of Sheba. This is beyond what I was told. I couldn't believe it, so I came to see it myself, and it's beyond what I was told. And so Solomon's kingship brings a blessing and glory to all, but also you have in these chapters, chapters 6 through 8, there you've got the building of the temple. And Solomon establishes proper worship, and so Israel flourishes. Again, this is all 12 tribes. Everyone's under Solomon. All Solomon's life. Everyone's under Solomon. And so there's glory, there's blessing in Israel through the wise and righteous administration of this son of David, Solomon. But especially, you have these 3 chapters dedicated to the building of the temple. That's one event, in 3 chapters. And so that tells us this is the most important thing Solomon does is establish right worship for the people. Putting all the priests and the Levites in place, getting the temple established and doing it just as the Lord had instructed, and getting that up and running. Okay. All right, and then the last section. So you have three points in this outline, and all the points begin in 1 Kings. Once we get to 1 Kings 11, it just runs through the rest of the book. Mallory, can you read our third outline point?
Solomon began the desecration of proper worship in Israel and it sent Israel into division, oppression, and lastly exile.
Okay. So you see in 1 Kings 11, end of Solomon's life, he marries foreign wives and he appeases them with their foreign gods, and this leads his heart astray. And then he gets in a little tit with Jeroboam, and then Jeroboam goes off to Egypt mad. But then when Solomon dies, people send to Jeroboam and say, hey, Solomon has died. And Jeroboam comes back and ends up leading the people away. And so Solomon is both the glory of Israel as he's faithful. But then his unfaithfulness leads to the division of the kingdom. Okay, so that's it. Our outline, 1 Kings 1, 3, and 11. And you've got a good outline for both books there. It's just all of 2 Kings falls under that third outline point. Yeah, Jim.
I was just trying to place it with some other books. So like Proverbs, I'm in that now.
Yeah.
That would have been written during the time when Solomon was a faithful king, and then Ecclesiastes would have been kind of at the end of his unfaithfulness.
Yeah.
And realization of.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't die for that, but I think that's true. And so if you have your what's that book about, you'll see that in the descriptions of those 2 books. Proverbs is the book of the wise king, Solomon, and he's writing all this stuff in his wisdom and his faithfulness, and he's communicating to his son and say, son, listen to my words. His words are the commands of Scripture, and listen to the words of your mother, who's teaching him the commands of Scripture. And he warns him of all these things and propels him into all these good things. That's Proverbs. Ecclesiastes, you see, and we'll look at it when we get to that book. End of Ecclesiastes, literally the last 2 verses begin, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the chief duty of man. And so Ecclesiastes is, Solomon looks out and he says, looks out all life and examines all things. And then he says, if you're just looking at appearances, this is a preview for Ecclesiastes. If you're just looking at appearances, it seems like a lot of times nothing you do matters. Sometimes the righteous man gets the wicked man's reward. And the wicked man gets the righteous man's reward. And Solomon says, this too, I say, is meaningless. But Solomon says, in the end, I've examined everything. And there's nothing better to do than to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the chief duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. End of book. So regardless of what happens to you in life for being faithful or unfaithful, you will face the Lord. And the reason for your creation is to follow him and walk in his ways. It's your chief end to do this. And so go ahead and do this. You may get slammed for it, like Jesus, Paul, Peter, and Jeremiah, everyone who's faithful. You may get slammed for being faithful. But if you're unfaithful, people may pat you on the back and it may seem easy for you. But you'll appear before the Lord. And so just be faithful, and who knows? You may wind up like Abraham, wealthy and blessed and at peace. Well, for being faithful. Or you may wind up like Jeremiah, down in a pit, thinking I'm going to die I won't wake up tonight or tomorrow morning. Okay. So yeah, Proverbs probably written during the earlier part of Solomon's life before unfaithfulness got into him. Later in his life, Solomon gets into unfaithfulness with the seeds of that earlier in his life through marrying foreign wives, but that really taking root in his soul probably a little bit later. But then coming to his senses by the end of his life and writing Ecclesiastes and saying, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Yeah, Bill.
Could we even say that Solomon was preceded by the promise against David? David's mistakes carrying on into Solomon's life, and then just error carried forward.
Yes, I think so. Yep. Yeah, because David married more women than one, which was sin. And took Bathsheba, killed her husband. And so there's a lot, and the curse that comes to David through Nathan the prophet is trouble in your family. And David has set forth an example. God is gracious with David, but Solomon should take that graciousness as, my father did these wicked things, and he and my family have suffered. I have 2 dead brothers now because of David's sin. And 3, if you count Absalom, or sorry, if you count Adonijah as well. So you got Adonijah, you got Absalom, and then first brother, 2 syllables. What's his name? Starts with an A. Sorry, second Samuel 13. But he's the one who rapes Tamar, that son. So all kinds of family. So the right response to the example of your father's sin is to say, what did my father receive for that sin? Therefore, I won't do it. Right? You don't follow in the sinful ways of your father, but you follow in the good ways of your father. And so Solomon doesn't learn that lesson correctly. And so David bears guilt, certainly, with Solomon's sinning. If David had been a faithful husband of one wife, and not, done the Bathsheba thing either, and all that, maybe IHCs, right? We don't have Solomon's unfaithfulness. Manny, did you have a question too?
Yeah, I was just curious. It seems, I don't know, ironic that David and Solomon kind of both had this individual timeline of faithfulness, and as they grow older, unfaithfulness, and then a repentant correction. Right? Yeah. So they both followed the same pattern. Yeah. How far down the lineage did that pattern persist, or did it kind of end with those 2? Or?
Yeah. Well, it speaks to us today, doesn't it? It really does. I mean, let's see. Arthur was born in 1932. He just had his birthday, so he's 92 now. I still keep on the birthday list. So I was wishing him a birthday a couple Mondays ago. Happy birthday. And I just think, I've got a long way to go till I'm 92, and hopefully I won't get there. Hopefully I'll be with the Lord before I'm 92. But there's still plenty of opportunity for me to go bad. And so this serves as warning, guys like Solomon, and for each of us. We are always capable of great sin, even in the midst of our great faithfulness. And so we always need to keep watch, as Paul says to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20:28, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. And he says to those elders in Ephesus, keep watch over yourselves. And then he goes on and talks about, I know when I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock. Even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw disciples away disciples after them. And so he's telling these elders, be watchful of yourself and over your own soul. And we're to do that too, because the wisest man who ever lived on the earth, great question, Manny, the wisest man who ever lived on the earth other than Jesus caused the division of Israel and exile and chaos and physical death of people as foreign nations came in and invaded. Solomon blew it for all Israel. He had the height of glory and peace. Solomon's name means peace. It's shalom. Solomon. Shalom. That's what Solomon's name is. It's just a different version. You shift the vowels around a little bit. But he's the king of peace. Jerusalem, that Salem is the same thing. Salem, Shalom, Solomon. That's all SLM. That's all the same piece there. And so he blew it. And so we are watchful over ourselves. We don't allow ourselves to look around and say, hey, right? Things are going great, and to take privileges like David did. All the kings around David and Solomon had multiple wives, and they went to men who were married and said, I want your wife, and they took them. That was standard practice for kings. They took the wives of their citizens. And so David does this. Solomon does this. They take many wives for themselves. They weren't allowing it for other people in Israel. Polygamy wasn't going on. We have no evidence of polygamy going on in Israel except for the kings. And that was a privilege that David and Solomon took to themselves because they became a king like the nations in that aspect. And so we never want to get to the place, every pastor who falls, kind of does that, right? Or many at least. They say, well, I'm in a prominent place and God has blessed me and got a big ministry going here. And so they start doing things that the law of God doesn't allow and leave their humility of seeing themselves under King Jesus and his good law for them. And this is why the king of Israel in Deuteronomy 17 is not to see himself above his brothers. It's one of the qualifications of the king. Not to see himself above his brothers. Not to see himself above everyone else has to obey the law, but I don't. And that's where Solomon got. And so it really is instructive for us. And we see this to get to your specific question, Manny, in the history of even the good kings in Judah. So you've got Joash, for instance. He's the little boy king. He's saved from his mother, or from his grandmother, Athaliah, who wants to be in charge. And her son, Ahaziah, dies after a year. And she takes charge, and she sends out that all the sons and relatives who could have a claim to the throne should be killed. And so she has them all killed. But Joash is hidden in the temple by a faithful priest, brought out 7 years later, and then becomes king. But when the faithful priest, Jehoiada, dies, Joash goes evil. So, yeah, we see that, a real mix of things. Hezekiah is good and bad. Josiah is bad at first and then is good and pretty much good for the rest of his life. But you do see a mix even among the good kings. Yeah, Joyce.
For Solomon, wasn't it also common practice for another country to give a wife to maintain peace or whatever?
Yeah.
So he would be tempted by the cultural norm.
That's right. Yeah. And so
watch out for cultural norms.
Yeah, you watch out for cultural norms, So I was watching a documentary or like a historical drama on Napoleon, and he did the same thing. He married princesses from other nations, so he could not have to be at war with Austria right now because he had married the Austrian princess, or up in Poland, and those kind of things. So yeah, certainly. Okay, good. So that's our outline there. The content of Kings, Mallory, or no, you went to Bill.
Solomon, chapters 1 through 11.
Okay, so when you're thinking about the content of Kings, Solomon dominates the first 11 chapters. If you want to read about Solomon, go to 1 Kings 1 through 11. Remember, Samuel is about what three prominent people? 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel, Saul, and David. And then 1 Kings 1, David's dying and handing over the kingship to Solomon. And so, but 1 Kings 1 is really about Solomon getting the kingship, properly being given the kingship, and David identifying Solomon as the one of all his sons that God had ordained to be king. And so then Solomon is chapters 1 through 11. John.
Divided Israel, 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 24.
Okay, and that's the book there. 2 Kings 12 or 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 24. Divided Israel. So if you want to read about the different kings in the north and the south and all the kings, everyone except the three united kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, all the other kings are in 1st and 2nd Kings, starting in chapter 12 of 1 Kings through the rest of the book. So that's where, if you want to find out, if you say there's some king in Israel or some king in Judah, come here, and that's where you'll find that king. Next, Chase. Or, sorry, Lily. You're hiding behind John's beard. Yeah, so divided Israel is Judah in the south, and then Chase. Israel in the north. Okay, so here's where we get divided kingdom. It's 1st and 2nd Kings, divided kingdom, and Judah is in the south, and it's Judah and Benjamin together, and then the 10 northern tribes are just known as Israel, or a lot of times in the prophets as a pejorative or kind of like a swear word, they're called Ephraim, and Ephraim was the largest northern tribe. And so sometimes the north just gets called Ephraim. And Ephraim was the first land north of Judah. So you had, if you're looking at Israel, so here's the Mediterranean Sea here, and you're looking at Israel. Here's Judah, and then here's Israel, and then in terms of tribal divisions and tribal land, the land of Ephraim was the big land, kind of right here. So Ephraim borders Judah for a good part of the border there, and so sometimes Israel in the north gets called Ephraim. So if you're reading the prophets and it says Ephraim, it's talking about northern Israel. Okay. Next, more content of Kings. Blake. Okay, so when we get to 2 Kings 17, so go ahead and turn there in your Bible, 2 Kings. When you get to 2 Kings 17, what you see is the destruction of Samaria. And so Samaria is a city. In Jesus' day, it's a region. But in the time of the divided kingdom, Samaria was a city. It was the capital city. It becomes the capital city of northern Israel. And it's defeated by the Assyrians in 722 BC. And Assyria, their foreign policy, what they do with the people they've conquered, is they scatter them in all the various lands that they've conquered. So when you conquer a land, the problem is that you don't want those people together to raise up a rebellion against you after you've conquered them. Right? Otherwise, you have to occupy their land with troops and that kind of thing. I mean, Napoleon ran into trouble with this. Hitler ran into trouble with this. He conquered these lands, but then the people were all still there, you know, and so they were, you know, there were rebellions coming up. And so what the Assyrians did is they took, and you see this in Second Kings 17, the people are scattered into all these different lands. And probably from this scattering is how we have Paul traveling around all over Turkey and Greece and finding synagogues. And in fact, Paul has grown up in Turkey. That's where Tarsus is. Tarsus is on the south coast of Turkey. And he's grown up as a good Jewish boy in a synagogue in Tarsus. And probably all those synagogues Paul's going to are there because Jews had been scattered from the 10 northern tribes during the time of Assyria's conquering in 722. And these were just communities that had never come back to the promised land. Okay? And so that happens before the book's done. And then the second exile we can talk about, big picture, is Ashley.
Exiled in South Judah by the Babylonians in 597 and 586 BC, 2 Kings 24 through 25.
Okay. So the Judahites stay around longer. And it's because in the north, how many of the kings that were not sons of David were faithful? None. So the curses of the covenant come to them sooner. You know, so you can do the math there, 722 minus 597, you know, and so you see there, it's, you know, what, 130 years, something like that, give or take, as you look at the various exportations of the Judahites, but they stay around. This is IHCs, right? You stave off the worst curse of the covenant through repenting and turning back to the Lord. And you see this in many of the kings. You see this in Manasseh. He repents, and you see this in Hezekiah. With when Isaiah writes, it's during Hezekiah's time, and Isaiah writes like the exile is going to happen right then and there by Assyria during Hezekiah's day. But Hezekiah becomes faithful to the Lord and pushes back, the exile for 100 years. Hezekiah is sitting around 700, and the exile doesn't happen until about 600. So that all happens in 2 Kings. So 2 Kings 17, you've got Assyria coming in. Assyria was the major world power. Babylon wasn't. Babylon was under Assyria in 722. And so Assyria comes in, and they exile the north. And then a few chapters later, we get to chapters 24 and 25. Post-Josiah, you've got Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin and Zedekiah and the exiles that happen with them in chapters 24 and 25. Now by Babylon, because now when you're around 600, 597, Babylon has become the major world power. I think it's 612 they conquer Assyria up in, they defeat Nineveh, and that's what the prophet Nahum is predicting, that the city of Nineveh will be no more, and that and that's what happens in 612, 610. Babylon conquers Assyria, and Babylon becomes the major world power. Nebuchadnezzar takes the throne at 605 and takes Daniel off, and comes back when Jehoiakim rebels and won't pay his taxes, then the main exile happens, and then last exile, 586, when the temple's destroyed. And so you read all about this stuff in 2 Kings there at the end. Okay, so that's content for us there. Other noteworthy figures in Kings. We've got, let's see, Jeff.
Elijah, 1 Kings 17 to 2 Kings 2.
Okay, so you have a break. You've got and when you're going through First Kings, you got king, 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 and then you get to the end of First Kings, and you've got all the Elijah narrative, and the kings kind of disappear, except where they're interacting with Elijah, and you're like, whoa, what happened here? Like, Jehoshaphat gets introduced, and then in First Kings, and then you have all this Elijah narrative, and Jehoshaphat ends up showing up again, like in 2 Kings 3, and then the king's narrative continues on after that. So Elijah's there. His apprentice is whom? Say it quickly. Elisha. Yeah, good. So Elisha comes along, and then he takes over and does more miracles and more things than Elijah had done. And then that's the book. Okay. There's a later version. This was after I was a kid. This is a later version of King Vitamin. When I was a kid, King Vitamin was like an actual old guy on the front of the box. But this is a cartoon sometime later. But yeah, so First and Second Kings, think Solomon and divided kingdom, and then you got Elijah and Elisha in there, right at kind of at the transition point. The end of First Kings is Elijah, and then Elisha comes in the front part of First Kings, or Second Kings, and then Second Kings takes you through all the rest of the kings, and the exile of the north, conquering of Samaria by Assyria, and then the exile of the south, and you read about Nebuchadnezzar coming in and conquering things and burning down the temple in 2 Kings 24 and 25. Yeah, Bill.
So the first king was Burger King, and the second king was King Vitamin.
That's right.
That's First and Second Kings.
First and Second Kings. That's right. In a nutshell. Yep.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah. Thanks. Now you know.
And then Reese's king size.
All right, let's pray.